She sat across from him at the kitchen table. The coffee was still hot, and her husband of 28 years looked at her and said the words he had clearly been practicing for a long time. He wanted a divorce, but that was not the worst part. The worst part came later, in a courtroom, in front of a judge, with a room full of people listening. His attorney stood up and called her negligible. No career, no income, no contribution. And then Douglas himself, the man she had given everything to, looked across that courtroom and said it out loud. She brought nothing. She is nothing. 28 years of raising his children, 28 years of running his household, 28 years of setting aside her own career, her own ambitions, her own name, so that his life could run perfectly, and he called it nothing. But here is what Douglas did not know. His own father had been watching. For 28 years, a quiet old man with careful handwriting and a drawer full of records had been paying attention, and he had written it all down, and he had made sure, very deliberately, very precisely, that the truth would be read out loud in the one place Douglas could not stop it. A courtroom. Stay with us. Because what happens next is not just a story about a divorce. It is a story about what happens when someone finally sees you, exactly as you are, and refuses to let that be forgotten. This story is for every woman who was ever told that what she gave was worth nothing. It is proof that the invisible work was never invisible to everyone. If this story speaks to something you have carried, something you have felt but never quite heard out loud, share it with someone who needs to hear it too. Leave a comment below. Tell us what this means to you. Like this video so more people find it. And subscribe to this channel, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories that see you. Stories that tell the truth.
The coffee was still hot. She would think about that detail for a long time afterward. How the mug was warm in both hands. How the morning light came through the kitchen window at the same angle it always did. How the birds were doing what birds do in September. How everything looked exactly the same. And then Douglas said the words. "I want a divorce." Carol heard them. All of them. She heard the careful spacing between each word. The slight pause before divorce, like he had considered a softer word first and rejected it. She heard the rehearsal in his voice. The evenness of a man who had practiced this speech in his car, or in the shower, or lying awake beside her while she slept. She set down the mug. Her hands were steady. She would wonder about that later. "How long?" she asked. He looked at the table. "A while." "That's not an answer, Douglas." "Carol, how long have you been thinking about this?" He looked up. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, not exactly. Something closer to the look he got when a business negotiation was not going the way he planned. Calculation. Adjustment. "Long enough," he said, "to know it won't change." She looked at her husband, 54 years old. The gray at his temples she had always found handsome. The way he sat, one arm on the table, body angled slightly away. The posture he always took when he did not want to be challenged. She knew every posture this man had. 28 years of postures. He's been practicing, she thought. He has been practicing this for a long time. She stood. She walked to the sink. She looked out the window at the backyard. The Japanese maple she had planted 12 years ago stood in the early morning light. It was finally the size she had always imagined it would be. "Is there someone else?" she asked. She kept her eyes on the maple. The pause was half a second too long. "That's not the issue here," Douglas said. There it was. She gripped the edge of the counter. Not hard. Just something solid to hold. Outside, a small brown bird landed on a maple branch, tilted its head once and was gone. "You should go to work," she said. "Carol, we need to go to work." Douglas. A chair scraped against the kitchen floor. Footsteps. The sound of his briefcase. The front door opening and closing with a careful, considered click. Not a slam. Even now he was controlled. She stood at the counter for a very long time. The coffee went cold. The light moved across the kitchen floor the way it always did on September mornings. The maple stood in the yard, still and unconcerned. Everything looked the same. Nothing was the same. She called Patrice at 8:45. She did not cry until she heard Patrice's voice. That was how it had always worked between them for 30 years. She could hold herself together for strangers, for silence, for empty rooms. But the moment someone who truly loved her said hello, something unlocked. He wants a divorce, Carol said. 3 full seconds of silence on the line. I'm coming over, Patrice said. You have school, I have a vice principal. I'm coming over. Patrice arrived 40 minutes later carrying a brown paper bag, a blueberry muffin, a bottle of orange juice, an energy bar that Carol had not asked for but ate anyway, standing at the counter. Then Patrice sat across from her at the same table Douglas had just vacated, and she took Carol's hands in both of hers. Tell me everything, Patrice said. So Carol told her. The rehearsed speech, the pause before the word, the half-second silence when she asked about someone else. Patrice's jaw tightened slowly. There's someone else, Patrice said. He said it's not the issue. Honey. Patrice squeezed both her hands. That is a man who has been sleeping with someone else long enough to feel rehearsed about it. In front of the woman who made his bed for 28 years. She paused. That is exactly the issue. Carol almost laughed. The sound that came out was something she did not quite recognize. What do I do? She asked. Patrice looked at her steadily and said, First, you eat the muffin. Carol ate the muffin. Then Patrice said, Second, you call a lawyer today, not tomorrow. Today. She called Leonard Graves that afternoon. His name had come from her friend Diane 2 years earlier. Diane had pressed his card into Carol's hand after her 3rd glass of wine at a dinner party and said, I hope you never need this. Carol had kept the card in the back of her recipe drawer, behind the car insurance card. She had told herself it was just in case. She had never let herself finish the thought of in case of what. Leonard Graves had a slow, deliberate voice and a careful way of listening. He let her speak without interruption. When she finished, he said, Mrs. Whitfield, based on what you have described, you have a strong case for equitable distribution. 28 years of marriage. 2 children raised to adulthood. A career set aside. A lifestyle established and maintained. He says he wants to be fair, Carol said. A pause on the line. People who intend to be fair, Leonard said carefully, do not typically retain attorneys who specialize in asset protection. She stared at the wall above the kitchen table. He's already hired someone? Barrett Coyne filed preliminary paperwork this morning on behalf of your husband. This morning, while she had been standing at the counter watching the bird on the maple branch, he had already filed. She pressed her hand flat against the table. He filed this morning. He sat across from me with coffee that was still hot, and he had already filed. He looked at me and said those words, and then he went to his office and filed. Mrs. Whitfield? Leonard said quietly. I'm here, she said. Yes. Let's talk about what I need to do. Meredith called at 5 in the afternoon. She already knew. Of course she already knew. Douglas had called both children before he came home to say those words. Carol had suspected as much, but the confirmation still stung. A small, clean cut in a precise place. Mom. Meredith's voice was tight and careful. Are you okay? I'm okay. You're not okay. You're right. I'm not okay. A pause. But I'm going to be. He told me it was mutual, Meredith said. Carol looked at the far wall of the kitchen. Mutual. The word sat in her chest like something swallowed sideways. It wasn't mutual, Carol said. But I'll be fine, sweetheart. I'm not taking sides, Meredith said quickly. The quickness of someone who had been rehearsing the words too. I can't do that. I need you to know that. I know. I'm not asking you to. What Carol did not say. You won't have to choose. The truth will do it for you. Eventually. What she did not say. Your father filed the paperwork before he finished his coffee. What she did not say. I am standing in the kitchen where I made 30,000 meals, and I cannot decide what to have for dinner. I love you, Mom, Meredith said. I love you too, sweetheart. After she hung up, Carol sat down on the kitchen floor. Not dramatically, not in any kind of collapse. She simply sat. Her back against the cabinet under the sink, her knees drawn up. The linoleum was cool through her jeans. The light in the kitchen changed as the afternoon turned toward evening. God, I was so stupid, she thought. Every single sign was right there. The late nights with explanations that were technically plausible. Stuff. The new gym membership he used twice. The way his phone went with him everywhere now, to the bathroom, to the garage, to the backyard, when he stood there for no reason she could see. The way conversations stopped when she walked into a room. The careful, considered distance between them in bed. The sex that had become obligatory, then rare, then absent, and both of them pretending not to notice. The signs were all there, she thought again. And I looked right at them and I said, this is just what a long marriage looks like. I said, this is just what being in your 50s looks like. I said, this is just us. She pressed her palms flat against the cool floor. I convinced myself that was the thing she would have to sit with. She had known, not the details, not the name, but the shape of it, the hollow center of their life together. She had known that for at least 2 years, maybe 3, and she had picked up that knowledge and set it back down very carefully. Because picking it up meant everything that followed. She sat on the floor until the kitchen went dark. Then she got up. She turned on the light. She opened the refrigerator and looked at it for a long time. Then she closed it. She ordered Thai food, small things, one foot, then the other. That was the only way she knew to go forward. 3 days after Douglas left, Carol found the hotel receipt. She had not been looking for it. Dust. She had been collecting the last of the things he had asked her to set aside, a set of files from the study. His father's cufflinks from the nightstand drawer, a phone charger he had forgotten. She was being dignified about all of it. Careful. She was making neat stacks on the dining room table and telling herself that this was how she would do this whole terrible thing, with dignity, with organization, with clean stacks. See, the receipt had slipped between the pages of a magazine on his nightstand, a folded rectangle of white paper, soft from being folded and unfolded more than once. She could feel that immediately, the softness of something handled repeatedly. The logo at the top read the Heron House, a boutique hotel 40 minutes outside the city. 2 nights, a room charge. A dinner reservation itemized below. Dinner for 2, November 17th. She sat down on the edge of the bed and held the paper between her fingers and turned that date over in her mind. She turned it over again, and then it landed. November 17th had been Garrett's birthday dinner last year. The whole family at a restaurant downtown. Douglas had arrived 20 minutes late, and she had watched the door, and when he finally came through it, he had kissed her on the cheek and said he'd been caught on a call. She had believed him. She had been glad he made it. God, she thought, how long has this actually been going on? Not a question. She already knew the answer was longer than she wanted to know. She called Leonard. I found a hotel receipt, she said, 14 months ago. Keep it, he said. Do not move it. Photograph it first, then keep the original. There might be more. There usually are, Leonard said. Mrs. Whitfield, do you have access to your joint accounts? She did. She rarely looked at them. Douglas had always handled the finances. That had seemed reasonable when the children were small, and she was managing every other aspect of the household. Sensible. A fair division of labor. Now, sitting on the edge of the bed with a soft hotel receipt in her hand, it seemed like something else entirely. She went to the kitchen table with her laptop. She had the login saved from years ago. She typed in the password and she pulled up 18 months of joint account history. She stared at the screen. The withdrawals were not dramatic. Douglas was too careful for dramatic. They were steady and regular. Transfers to an account she did not recognize. 1,200 here, 2,300 there. Small enough that a busy woman managing a household might not notice. Large enough, added together over 18 months, to matter significantly. She got out a legal pad. She started writing down the dates and the amounts in her neat, even handwriting. The kitchen was very quiet. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, the September evening was going gold. She wrote for a long time. She had not always been this still. At 24, Carol Ann Brennan had been the kind of woman who talked fast and laughed louder than she meant to. She always had 3 projects going at once and a 4th idea forming. She had been 3 months into a real job, not a starter position, but an actual marketing role at a mid-sized firm downtown, with a salary and a trajectory and a supervisor, who had pulled her aside at the 6-month mark and used the word exceptional. She had been good at it. Then she met Douglas Whitfield at an industry conference on a Thursday afternoon in October. He was charming. He was certain of himself in a way that felt, at 24, like strength. He looked at her like she was the only person in the room. And at 24, that was a very powerful thing to experience. They were married 18 months later. She left the marketing job when Meredith came. It made logical sense. Douglas's business was in its critical growth phase. They could not both be working full force at the same time. They would reassess in a year. A year became two. Two became the small children years, the years that blur together in the beautiful, exhausted way of early parenthood. Then Garrett arrived. Then the bigger house. Then the school committees and the neighborhood association and the charity boards that Douglas felt they should be visible on. Then the dinner parties and the client entertaining and the household that was, in truth, a full-time operation that required constant management. I'll go back, she had told herself. She told herself that at 26, at 30, at 38, at 42. Now she sat at a kitchen table, and the marketing experience on her resume ended in the year 1999. She was 52 years old. She had not drawn a paycheck in 28 years. Not that the work had stopped. It had never stopped. The cooking and the scheduling and the managing. The driving and the doctor's appointments and the school events. The birthday parties and the holiday hosting and the 1,000 invisible logistics that kept 4 people's lives running smoothly. The emotional labor, the particular invisible work of noticing when someone was struggling and doing something about it before it became a crisis. None of that showed up on a resume. None of it, according to the preliminary filings Barrett Coyne had submitted, was something Douglas considered a financial contribution to their marriage. She read that line from the filing again. The respondent made no material financial contribution to the marital estate. No material financial contribution. She read it a third time. Something began to burn low in her chest. Not tears, not yet. Something hotter than tears. Something she did not have a polite name for yet. She went to see Leonard in person the following week. His office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown with windows that looked out on an oak tree, just beginning to show its fall color. October light came through the leaves in long amber slices. Carol sat across from his desk and put the legal pad in front of him. 18 months of transfers, she said. I haven't gone back further yet. He looked at the pages carefully. He took his time. We will go back further, he said. What does this mean legally? Leonard leaned back. He laced his fingers together on the desk. It means your husband has been moving marital assets for some time, possibly in deliberate preparation for this filing. Either way, it is relevant to the court's view of the proceedings. Is it legal? What he did? That is what we are examining. Leonard. He looked at her directly. It is the kind of pattern that makes a judge take a particular interest in how a husband characterizes his marriage. She thought about the filing language. No material financial contribution. He's going to tell a judge I contributed nothing, she said. His attorney will argue that the estate was built through your husband's professional efforts. Yes. I raised 2 children. I managed this family for 28 years. I supported his career at the cost of my own. Yes. That is not nothing. No, Leonard said quietly. It is not nothing. Not by any reasonable measure. She looked at the window, the October oak, the amber light. He is going to stand in a courtroom and tell a judge I am worthless, she said. The word surprised her. She had not planned to use it, but it was the right word. She felt it in every line of Barrett Coyne's filings, the dismissal, the reduction, the act of making a person into a line item and then assigning that line item a value of 0. Leonard looked at her steadily for a moment. There is something else I have been meaning to ask you, he said. Your father-in-law, Walter Whitfield. He passed 8 months ago. Yes, his estate. Do you know the terms of his will? She shook her head. Douglas handled all of it. He said there wasn't much. Some savings, the family house in Millhaven. Douglas inherited the house, and Douglas said the remainder went to charity. Did you see the actual will? No, Douglas said. She stopped. Something moved through her. A small shift, like a floorboard settling? No, I didn't see it, just. Leonard wrote something on his notepad. I want to find the will, he said. Why? He set down his pen. Because Walter Whitfield ran a hardware business for 40 years. He put his son through college. He owned property in 2 counties. He paused. Men like that rarely leave wills as simple as not much in charity. She sat with that. Walter loved me, she said quietly, more to herself than to Leonard. I know, Leonard said. He served as your character witness when you and Douglas applied for the Millhaven Property Trust 8 years ago. He vouched for you specifically, by name, with written documentation. That she felt something move through her that she could not name yet. Something like a door she had not known was there somewhere behind her. Find the will, she said. I intend to, Leonard said. The thing about being erased slowly is that you stop noticing the edges. Carol thought about this in the weeks that followed, lying awake at 3 in the morning, with the bed feeling too wide and the dark too complete. Year 1 of the marriage. She had stopped going to the gym at her usual time, because Douglas preferred quiet mornings, and her 6 a.m. routine disturbed him. Year 3. She had stopped taking on freelance marketing projects because the irregular hours complicated the household schedule. Year 7. She had given up the small spare room she used as a home office because Douglas's firm needed overflow storage space for documents, and it only made sense. Year 12. She had stopped having firm opinions about where they vacationed. It was easier. Year 16. She had caught herself apologizing for things that were not her fault. 3 times in a single week. She had noticed. She had told herself to stop doing it. She had not stopped. Year 20. She had said something smart at a dinner party, something funny and well-timed, about a news story, and the table had laughed. In the car afterward, Douglas had said, "You don't always have to hold court, Carol." She had been careful in the car ever since. Somewhere along the way, she thought, I became invisible, not all at once, a little at a time. Until one morning, I looked in the mirror, and I was not sure what was me and what was just the outline of whoever he needed me to be. She got up. 3:47 in the morning, she made a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table with the printed account transfers spread out in front of her. She had organized them by date. She had highlighted the recurring transfers in yellow. I'm not crazy, she thought, looking at those pages. I know exactly what I see. She picked up a fresh highlighter and got back to work. 6 weeks into the separation, Patrice came to collect Carol and take her to dinner. Not a pity dinner. Patrice had been very clear about that when she called. Just, I am feeding you a real meal in a real restaurant, and we are going to talk about something other than Douglas Whitfield for at least 45 minutes. Just. She arrived at Carol's door at 7, wearing good earrings and a coat that meant business. They went to a small Italian place 2 miles from the house. Red walls, candles on the tables. Just. A wine list that Patrice consulted with appropriate seriousness. They ordered. They drank wine. Patrice talked for 20 minutes about a situation at school involving a parent, a cell phone policy, and what she described as the most confident wrongness I have witnessed in 11 years of administration. Carol laughed. Real laughter, not the polite social kind. The kind that comes from somewhere warm. Then Patrice set down her wine glass and said, "Tell me about Sandra Fielding." Carol looked at her. "How do you know her name?" "I Googled her," Patrice said without any apology at all. "She is an associate at his firm. Been there 2 years. 38 years old. Very pretty. LinkedIn photo that says, I take myself extremely seriously and I also have very good hair. Despite everything, despite the hotel receipt and the account transfers and the sleepless nights, and the word negligible sitting in her chest like a stone, Carol laughed. She is very pretty, Carol agreed. She is, said Patrice. She is also a 38-year-old woman who has been sleeping with a married man who told her enough lies to keep her interested. That is not a story with a happy ending on her side either. Carol turned her wine glass slowly on the table. You don't hate her? Oh, I hate her, Patrice said pleasantly. I just also pity her a small amount. Because she thinks she won something. She does not realize yet that she has won Douglas Whitfield, who is the booby prize. The candle on the table flickered in a draft from the door. He told her I was unhappy too, Carol said. That's what Meredith told me. He told Sandra that we had both agreed the marriage wasn't working, that it was mutual. He told her the exact same lie he told his own children. He told everyone the same story. Of course he did, Patrice said. That is what happens when a person gets very efficient at lying. He only has the one version. Carol was quiet for a moment. She looked at the candle flame. Meredith knows I'm not telling her everything, she said. Meredith is 27, and she has your brain. Of course she knows. I don't want to be the parent who poisons her children against their father. Patrice looked at her steadily across the table. The candlelight made her expression very clear. There is a difference, she said carefully, between poisoning and telling the truth. I know. Do you? Carol looked at the tablecloth. I keep asking myself, what does it serve? If I give Meredith every detail, what does that accomplish? She still has to have a father. She still has to navigate holidays and eventually a wedding and grandchildren. She still has to have him in her life. He made himself what he is, Patrice said gently. That is not your authorship, Carol. You did not write that story. They sat with that for a while. The restaurant moved around them, other tables, other conversations, other lives carrying their own weight. Then Patrice refilled both their glasses and said, all right, tell me about the will. I have always deserved better than this. She had not been able to say it out loud yet, but she had begun to think it, clearly and without qualifier at 3 in the morning. It was a start. The search for Walter's will had taken Leonard 3 weeks and a formal filing in probate court. Douglas had been resistant. Barrett Coyne had submitted 2 formal objections to the discovery request. Both had been denied. Walter Whitfield's last will and testament, as filed with the Mill Haven County Probate Court in the final year of his life, was 4 pages long. Carol read a summary of the document sitting in Leonard's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The oak tree outside had gone deep gold. She read the summary twice. Then she set it down on Leonard's desk with careful hands and looked at the opposite wall. The family home in Mill Haven, appraised at approximately $380,000, had been left to Douglas, exactly as Douglas had told her. The investment portfolio, the savings accounts, the contents of 2 safe deposit boxes at a bank in Mill Haven, these had been left to Carol Ann Whitfield, by name, with an explicit notation that read, to be distributed to Carol Ann Whitfield as her individual property, not subject to marital estate claims. Total value, just under $900,000. Not to Douglas, to Carol. He knew, she said. Her voice was very quiet in the room. He appears to have been planning this for some time, Leonard said. The will was revised 14 months ago. He paused, which is approximately the same time the transfers from your joint account began. She stared at the wall. Walter knew Douglas was moving money. That is my reading of the timeline, yes. He knew what was coming. Her throat tightened. He was protecting me before I knew I needed protecting. There is something more, Leonard said. He slid a single page across the desk toward her. She picked it up. It was a letter, handwritten in blue ink, notarized, attached to the will as a formal addendum, with written instructions directing the executor to read it aloud in any legal proceeding involving Carol's interests. Walter's handwriting was precise and angular. The handwriting of a man who had spent 40 years measuring things lumber and pipe and quantities of hardware and had never lost the habit of exactness. She read the first line. To anyone who tries to tell you Carol Whitfield contributed nothing. Let me tell you what I watched her give. Her eyes burned. She kept reading. She could not read the whole letter that day. She read 3 paragraphs and then she had to stop. She told Leonard she needed a moment. He stood without comment and left the room, pulling the door softly behind him. She sat alone in his office with the October light coming through the window and an old man's letter in her hands, and she cried. Not grief, exactly. Something more complicated than grief. Something that needed a word she didn't have. Walter had seen her. He had sat in her kitchen for holiday dinners and ordinary Sunday afternoons for 28 years. He had been at the table for 4-year-old Meredith's birthday parties, and for Garrett's high school graduation dinner, and for the quiet Christmas when Douglas had been difficult, and Carol had kept everything running anyway. He had been present for all of it, and he had seen her, not as Douglas's wife, not as the mother of his grandchildren, not as the woman who kept things organized and made things run and solved things before they became problems, as Carol Ann. She had loved Walter. the warm, uncomplicated love you feel for a good man. When he got sick, she had driven him to his appointments on the days Douglas was busy, which was most days. She had sat with him through the difficult months. First, she had been holding his hand when he died. Douglas had been at a conference. She had thought, sitting beside Walter's bed in those final weeks, that loving people without expectation of anything in return was simply the right way to live. She had not been wrong. She had simply not known what return could look like. She called Meredith that evening. "I want to tell you something," Carol said. "Not everything, but enough." Meredith was quiet on the line. "Father is going to argue in court that I made no financial contribution to our marriage," Carol said. "That is his legal position. I want you to know that it is not accurate, and I want you to know that I can demonstrate that." A long silence. "Mom," Meredith said finally, "Grandpa Walter's will." Carol paused. "What do you know about the will?" "Dad has been upset about it for weeks, since the probate filing came through." Meredith's voice was careful. He told me he told Garrett and me both that he had handled everything after Grandpa passed, that there was nothing unusual. He seemed very certain of that." Carol sat very still at the kitchen table. "He thought the old will was still in effect," she said slowly. "Yes, but Walter changed it 14 months ago." "Yes." Silence. "Just." Then Meredith said, in a voice working very hard at steadiness, "Mom, what did Grandpa leave you?" Carol closed her eyes. Outside the kitchen window, the Japanese maple had gone the deep red of October. The color Walter had always loved best in it. He had told her that once, standing in the same yard, 4 years after she had planted it. "That red is the best thing about autumn," he had said. She had agreed with him. "He left me enough," she said softly. "Grandpa left me enough." The anger came late that night while she was washing the dinner dishes. Not the shaking kind of anger. Not the tearful kind. The other kind. The quiet, clear kind that settles in the center of your chest and does not move. The kind that has stopped apologizing. She was washing a bowl, the same ceramic bowl she had washed approximately 10,000 times over the course of this marriage. And it arrived in her, fully formed and certain. He had called her worthless. Not in those words. Not yet, not out loud, but in every legal filing, in every page Barrett Coyne had submitted, in the phrase "no material contribution," just. In the assumption stated without apology, as simple fact that $900,000 of assets left to Carol by a man who had watched her for 28 years could simply be absorbed into the marital estate because she was, at bottom, just a wife. Just a wife. She set the bowl down in the dish rack. "I am not just anything," she thought, and the thought arrived without the soft qualifiers she would have attached to it a year ago. "No, I think maybe, or I feel like, or I could be wrong, but none of that. Just, I am not just anything." She dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She went to her laptop on the kitchen table. She pulled up the account records Leonard had been compiling. The joint assets, the marital estate, the numbers that represented 28 years of a shared life. She looked at them like they already had her name on them, because they did. The first formal court date was in early November. Leonard had told her it would be procedural. Asset valuation, preliminary disclosures, scheduling, nothing emotionally significant. He told her to wear something neutral and to expect a great legal language and very little drama. He had not accounted for Barrett Coyne's particular style. Douglas's attorney was the kind of man who treated every room as a stage and every proceeding as a performance. Tall, expensive suit. The specific brand of polished aggression that comes from confusing intimidation with intelligence for so many years that the distinction is no longer detectable. He shook Leonard's hand in the hallway with the grip of a man who considers every handshake a small competition. Carol sat beside Leonard at the plaintiff's table in a navy blazer she had chosen carefully that morning. Not because she believed clothing won court cases, but because she had spent 28 years choosing clothing with other people's preferences in mind, and she was finished with that. The navy was what she wanted. Douglas sat at the table across the aisle, topped. He had not looked at her directly. He had not looked at her directly since September. He is not sorry, she thought, watching him. He is inconvenienced. Judge Holden entered, and the room stood. Just. She was a compact woman in her 60s with reading glasses And the specific contained authority of someone who has seen every variation of this kind of human suffering and has not allowed it to make her callous or performative. She moved through the docket with efficient patience. The proceedings were administrative, numbers, schedules, legal language, and measured exchanges. Then Barrett Coyne rose to address the characterization of assets. He spoke about Douglas's business holdings, the growth trajectory, the professional achievements. He was smooth and specific, and he built his case like a man stacking bricks, each one placed deliberately. And then he said it. My client built this enterprise through decades of skilled professional effort. The respondent, by contrast, has no professional history to speak of, no career, no income record, no independent financial track record whatsoever. Her contributions to the marital estate have been, frankly, negligible. The word landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Negligible. Leonard placed a hand lightly on Carol's forearm. The lightest possible pressure. A message, wait, not yet. Stay. She had not planned to speak. She knew this was not her turn. She understood the protocol. She had promised Leonard she would let him handle every exchange. But she looked across the aisle at Douglas, and Douglas was looking at his own notes. Not at her, not at the attorney speaking on his behalf. And there was something in his posture, the boredom of it, the complete absence of any acknowledgement that something was happening here, that involved a real human being who had given real years, that burned through whatever composure she had constructed. She said it quietly, clearly, not to anyone in particular. I raised your children. Douglas looked up. The room went absolutely still. Judge Holden looked at Carol over the top of her reading glasses. Leonard said very quietly, Mrs. Whitfield, I apologize. Your Honor, Carol said. That was not appropriate. I'm sorry for the interruption. Judge Holden studied her for a moment. Then she looked at Barrett Coyne, then back at the papers in front of her. Counselor Coyne, she said evenly, I would recommend keeping your characterizations to documented figures. This court does not require editorial framing. She made a note. Continue. Barrett Coyne looked briefly, precisely annoyed. Then he continued. Douglas had gone back to his notes, but Carol had seen his face in that half second. When she said, I raised your children, she had watched something move through him. Not guilt, not recognition of anything he owed her, irritation. Like a phone ringing in a meeting. A distraction from a room he had already mentally left. I deserved so much better than this, she thought. I deserved better than this for a very long time. Afterward, she sat in Leonard's car in the parking garage, not crying, just sitting. Her hands in her lap, her purse beside her. The garage smelled like cold concrete and exhaust. He was planning to say that all along, she said. Yes, Leonard said. Barrett Coyne is very skilled at provoking emotional responses from opposing parties. It makes reasonable women appear unreasonable. I should have prepared you more specifically. Carol looked at the gray concrete wall. Someone had scratched 2 initials inside a rough heart years ago. The scratches had weathered to almost nothing. Almost. What happens at the formal hearing? She asked. The formal hearing is where everything is presented fully, where the will comes in. Leonard paused. 6 weeks. He doesn't know what's in the letter, she said. He knows the will was changed. The full contents of Walter's letter, no. He does not know. She felt something shift in her chest. Not warmth, exactly. Something cleaner and cooler than warmth. Clarity. Good, she said. She drove home through the November afternoon. The trees along the boulevard had gone fully bare, gray branches against a white sky. It was the kind of view that some people found bleak. Carol found it honest, clean. The kind of beauty that has nothing left to hide. She thought about the woman she had been at 24, 3 months into her first real job. Exceptional. She had held that word in a private pocket for 28 years, never shown it to anyone. The only version of herself that had existed before the negotiation began. She thought about what returning to work might mean now, at 52, with a resume gap like a canyon. With a world that had moved 28 years forward without her. Then she thought, not back, forward, entirely forward. She had spent 28 years managing logistics that a corporation would have required a team to replicate. Scheduling and budgeting and event management. Medical and nutritional oversight for 4 people. Emotional management for a household, community representation, property upkeep and vendor coordination. Without a salary, without acknowledgement, without, apparently, being considered a contribution. Fine. Let them put that in a filing. She knew what it was. And in 6 weeks, in a courtroom, housed her. Walter Whitfield was going to tell everyone else what it was too. Garrett called on a Sunday afternoon, the week after the first hearing. He did not call often. Not because he didn't love her. He called when something had pressed its way to the surface and he could no longer ignore it. Dad says there's a complication with Grandpa's will, he said. There is no complication, Carol said. Your grandfather was very clear about his wishes. He left you money. He did, and Dad didn't know about it. He did not know the full extent of it, no. Dad says it was supposed to go to the whole family. Carol looked out the kitchen window at the bare maple. Its branches were skeletal against the gray November sky. I am the family, Garrett, she said. I have been the family for 28 years. Silence on the line. Garrett needed time with things before they came out. Unlike Douglas, what came out after Garrett processed was usually honest. Mom, he said. Then nothing for a moment. I've been thinking about when we were growing up. She waited. You did everything, he said. Like all of it. And it was just I never thought about it as something you were doing. It was just how things were. I never Garrett. I'm sorry I never Garrett. She said it gently. You were a child. Children are not supposed to account for their parents' labor. That is not your job. It has never been your job. But still, she agreed. Thank you for saying it. They talked for an hour after that about ordinary things. His apartment, which needed new furniture. The woman he was seeing who sounded, from Carol's careful assessment, like someone worth being careful with. The new project at work. After she hung up, she sat, belonged for a long time with the phone warm in her hand. He sees me, she thought. Both of them see me. That was more than she had let herself hope for. The real breakdown came on a Wednesday. Not the crying kind. Not the dramatic kind that arrives with a clear cause and resolves with a cathartic sob. Dust. The real kind, the structural kind, arrives without a specific trigger on an ordinary weekday, when you are simply walking from one room to another and something in you decides it is finished holding the shape. She had been walking from the kitchen to the living room. She could not remember why. And she stopped in the hallway between the two rooms and she looked at the house around her. 19 years in this house. She had painted these walls. She had gone through 8 paint samples to get the warm cream of the hallway, right standing at the hardware store on a Saturday morning, holding little rectangles of color up to the light, trying to find the one that would make the space feel like coming home. She had stood in this hallway at 6 in the morning for 19 years, and it had felt like coming home. The bookshelves she had custom ordered, the curtains she had sewn herself during a 3-month phase that produced 4 pairs and a linen tote bag she still used. The photos on the walls, tossed. The collection of small ceramic pieces on the shelf by the door, each one from a different trip, each one with a memory attached. This house was the version of herself she had been able to build. In a few months, or however long the divorce took to finalize, she would have to leave it. Because you cannot stay in a house that belongs half to someone else. Because staying would mean he was still somehow here. Because the practical and the necessary were going to require her to go. She slid down the hallway wall, not like movies. Slowly, deliberately. Her back against the wall, knees drawn up, the same position she had taken on the kitchen floor on the first night. The linoleum was cold through her jeans. She stayed there for a long time. The sleet started outside. She could hear it against the window at the end of the hall. A thin, insistent sound. December sleet. She thought about the inventory, not angrily, not dramatically, just honestly. Her career. The trajectory that had existed at 24 and then stopped. Her financial independence. The specific freedom that comes from money you earned yourself, that no one else can take away. Her confidence. She had not noticed it leaving. That was the thing. It had gone so gradually that each individual loss seemed like nothing, a sentence not finished, a preference not stated, an opinion not defended, because the energy of defending it against his patient, tireless dismissal had simply become too expensive. Her name. Carol Ann Whitfield had existed for 28 years. Carol Ann Brennan, the woman who had existed before, felt like someone met briefly at a party. Interesting, vivid, gone before the address could be exchanged. She sat in the hallway and she let herself know all of it, the full inventory, without softening and without drama. The hardest part, she thought, is admitting I knew. I knew for a long time, not about Sandra Fielding, not specifically, about the hollowness, the slow withdrawal of Douglas's attention. The way the center of their life together had gone quiet and then quieter, and then so quiet she had started filling it with busyness, just to avoid hearing the silence. She had looked at all of that and chosen not to pick it up, because picking it up meant this. Starting over feels impossible, she thought. The sleet hit the window, but staying feels worse. And then, plain and declarative, with no softness and no question attached, I deserve better than this. I have always deserved better than this. She sat with that thought in the quiet hallway. She let it be true. She did not argue with it or qualify it or wonder if she was being unreasonable. She let it be true. It went somewhere inside her and it stayed. She called her doctor the next morning. Not in crisis. She knew the difference between crisis and the slower, heavier thing she was carrying. But she also knew they could travel together if you were not paying attention. The disrupted sleep, the inconsistent eating, the difficulty she had been having imagining anything beyond the next few hours. That last one was the signal she had been watching for. Dr. Sandra Mercer had been Carol's physician for 11 years. She was a practical woman who listened without interrupting and gave information without condescension. Carol told her everything. The separation, the legal proceedings, the Wednesday on the floor. Sandra listened. Then she said, I think a low dose of an antidepressant is appropriate here, alongside regular therapy. What you are experiencing is a significant neurological response to a major life disruption. There is no merit in white-knuckling through it when support is available. Carol cried in the doctor's office, the efficient, matter-of-fact kind of crying that happens when someone says something simple and true that you have needed to hear. I don't know who I am without this marriage, Carol said. Sandra Mercer looked at her steadily. You were someone before it. That was a very long time ago. It still counts, Sandra said. She is still in there, just compressed. She started therapy with Wendy Callahan on a Tuesday in early December. Wendy's office was bright and warm, with a good chair and a plant on the windowsill that was aggressively, almost defiantly alive. Wendy had the uncommon skill of asking questions that caused Carol to discover things she had not known she already knew. Tell me about the first year of the marriage, Wendy said in their second session. I was happy, Carol said. Genuinely. What specifically made you happy? Douglas, building something together. The feeling that the future was being constructed. When did that shift? Carol thought for a while. Year 4, she said. I went back to work. Part-time. Freelance marketing projects. Douglas wasn't against it exactly. He just wasn't. He didn't encourage it. And I started picking up projects. She paused. It felt like she stopped. Like what? Wendy said. Like oxygen, Carol said. Like I had been holding my breath and I didn't know it. What happened? It created friction. The children were small. His hours were long. He said he felt like we were passing in the night, that we had become two separate ships. Was that accurate? Carol looked at the plant on the windowsill. It was a pothos, she thought. Practically impossible to kill. She had always admired that about pothos plants. I was working 3 hours a week, she said. Freelance. That was the full extent of my separate ship. She paused. I stopped when Meredith started kindergarten. I told myself it was the right time. Was it? It was the convenient time. For Douglas. She heard herself say it. The plainness of it. I gave up my oxygen, and I told myself I chose to. Wendy waited. I think I made a choice under conditions I didn't fully understand, Carol said slowly. I was 28 years old and I loved my husband and I wanted the marriage to work. And I thought the cost of working was the marriage. And the cost of not working was just a job. And now, Carol looked at her hands. Now I know the cost of not working was me, she said. It was a very long trade. She drove home from that appointment through the December dark. City lights were up for Christmas. The trees along the main street downtown had white lights wound through the bare branches, clean and bright against the dark wood. She stopped at a red light and looked at them. Then, without deciding to, she rolled down her window. December air hit her face, cold and sharp and completely real. She had not done that in a long time. Rolled the window down in December just to feel the air. She breathed it in. The light turned green. She drove with the window down for 3 more blocks before she closed it. January arrived cold and clear. Carol reorganized her closet on a Saturday night, not because it needed it. The closet had been organized the same way for years, Douglas's side, her side, the careful geographical neutrality of a shared space. But Douglas's half was empty now. His things had been collected in November, and her side had not moved, as though the empty space beside it were still occupied by something invisible. She started at 8 in the evening. She took everything out, every hanger, every folded sweater stacked on the shelf, every pair of shoes from the rack. She laid it all on the bed and she looked at it. Then she put it back, but differently. Not organized for his preferences. Not organized for the shape of their life together. Organized for her. The dresses she actually wore moved to the front. The ones she had kept because he liked them in the particular way that meant she should keep wearing them, went to the back. The shoes she loved but had called impractical for years moved to eye level. The things she wore because they were safe moved to the shelf. She worked until midnight. The house was quiet around her. The closet smelled like cedar. At the back of the top shelf, behind a box of winter accessories, she found a scarf, silk, deep rose. She had bought it herself 10 years ago at a boutique downtown, impulse and pleasure, and exactly what she had wanted. She had worn it home. Douglas had looked at it and said, "That color is a bit much, don't you think?" She had not worn it since. She put it on now. She stood in front of the bedroom mirror in her pajamas with a deep rose silk scarf around her neck, and she looked at herself in the mirror. Hello, she thought. Something small and tentative. Something that felt, very faintly, like beginning. She drove to Leonard's office the following Tuesday. The hearing was in 2 weeks. He wanted to walk through the letter. The oak tree outside his window had small buds forming at the ends of its bare branches. January buds, pushing through in the cold because that was what they were designed to do. She sat across from Leonard, and she read Walter's letter in full for the first time. She had read 3 paragraphs in November before she had to stop. She was ready for all of it now. Walter had written it by hand over the course of several days, he told his attorney, in the last winter of his life. He had then given it to be notarized and formally attached to the will with specific instructions. He had known what he was doing. He had planned it carefully. He wrote about Carol. He wrote about watching her for 28 years. He wrote about the Thanksgiving when Douglas had forgotten Carol's birthday. It fell near the holiday, and Douglas had simply not acknowledged it. Even as Carol hosted 23 people and produced a perfect dinner and kept everything running. Walter had found her alone in the kitchen for a moment, checking on something in the oven, and he had said, "Happy birthday, Carol." She had looked at him with such surprise, and then such gratitude, that something in that look had told him everything he needed to know. He wrote about the appointments, the weeks he had spent in treatment, Carol driving him, sitting with him, managing the paperwork and the prescriptions and the communication with the doctors, while Douglas sent texts from conferences. "I watched my son build something real," Walter wrote. "But I watched him build it the way some men build things, on a foundation they refuse to acknowledge." Carol was that foundation. She ran the household, raised the children, managed the life that gave him the freedom to build. She did it with care and without complaint and without receiving what she was owed. I am an old man, and I am running out of patience for pretending I do not know what I know. My son is capable of great things, and he is also capable of taking good things entirely for granted. He has taken Carol for granted for many years. I believe he intends to take her for granted one more time, in the legal proceedings that will follow my death. I cannot speak from a grave, but I can arrange for this letter to be read in the only room where it cannot be dismissed. And I have changed my estate accordingly so that when my son is finished counting what he believes is his, Carol will have something of her own to stand on. She set the letter down on Leonard's desk. He planned this for over a year, she said. Yes. He knew Douglas was moving money. He saw the pattern, and he made his own preparations. That is what the timeline indicates. And Douglas thought he'd handled everything. She paused. After Walter died, he thought the old will was in effect. He told the children that. He told several people that, Leonard said carefully. She looked at the January light on the office wall. Walter saw everything, she said. He kept records, Leonard said, very meticulous records. Which brings me to one more thing. He hesitated, which was unusual for him. The letter includes documentation of financial irregularities Walter observed in the family trust over the last 3 years. Transactions that, he chose his words carefully, transactions that pass through accounts Douglas managed that appear inconsistent with the trust's stated purpose. Carol looked at him. Douglas was taking from the family trust, she said. I am using the word irregularities until we have a complete accounting. But yes, that appears to be what the documentation suggests. She thought about Douglas at the kitchen table in September. The rehearsed calm, the careful words. Long enough to know it won't change. He had calculated everything. He had filed before the coffee cooled. He had moved money. He had hired the best asset protection attorney he knew. He had told his children it was mutual. He had not calculated Walter. He had never understood his own father. He thought he got away with it, Carol said quietly. Walter noticed everything, Leonard said. She sat in her car in Leonard's parking lot for a long time afterward, not upset, not triumphant, something steadier and quieter than either. She thought about Walter in those final weeks, the long afternoons in the hospital room, the light coming in from the west. The particular quality of conversation that happens between people who know time is limited and have decided to be honest. Once, near the very end, he had taken her hand and held it for a moment and said, "You're a good person, Carol. I hope you know that." She had smiled and said she thought he might be biased. He had shaken his head. "I'm not biased. I've just been paying attention." She had thought that was love, simple and warm and complete. She understood now that it was also something else. It was witness. It was someone saying, "I see you, and I have written it down." She started the car. She drove not home but to a restaurant she had been wanting to try for 2 years. A small place on the east side of the city, good reviews, a menu that looked interesting. She had mentioned it to Douglas once, and he had said the neighborhood wasn't convenient. She went alone. She sat at a corner table. She ordered what she wanted. She had a glass of wine that was exactly right. She wore the rose silk scarf tucked around her collar because she liked the color, and it was hers. She ate slowly, and she looked at the other people in the restaurant, and she thought about nothing urgent. It was the best meal she had eaten in months. The formal hearing was on a Tuesday in late January, cold and clear. The sky above the courthouse parking lot was the particular hard blue of January mornings that have no patience for anything soft. Carol arrived 45 minutes early. She sat in her car with the heater running. She had worn charcoal gray and her good winter coat. The silk scarf was tucked inside the collar where she could feel it. She thought about Walter. She had asked Leonard the week before, "Will it be cruel? What he wrote, is it cruel to Douglas?" Leonard had considered the question honestly. "It is truthful," he said. "Honest in a way that is very kind to you." Walter makes clear that he loves his son. He also makes clear that loving someone does not require you to pretend about who they are. That was Walter, she thought. He could hold both things at once. The courtroom was medium in size, formal without excess. Judge Holden took her place at the front, and the room stood and sat again with the practiced quiet of formal proceedings. Barrett Coyne opened for Douglas. He was polished and precise. He constructed the narrative of Douglas Whitfield as a self-made, professional, hard-working, decisive, the architect of everything they had built together. He cited figures and dates and valuations. He made 28 years of shared life sound like a business in which one partner had done all the actual work. Carol kept her face neutral. She had practiced that. Leonard had worked with her on it specifically. Leonard presented Carol's case methodically. He entered the household financial documentation. He presented the career sacrifice analysis. He cited the established legal precedent for domestic contribution. He entered the account transfer records. Barrett Coyne objected at intervals. Judge Holden ruled each time with patient efficiency. Then Leonard said, "Your Honor, I would like to submit into the record the amended will and accompanying notarized letter of the late Walter James Whitfield, filed with Millhaven County Probate Court 14 months before the filing of this divorce action." Barrett Coyne was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, this document." "Let me see it," Judge Holden said. The room was very still while she read. Barrett Coyne stood at his table. Douglas had gone very still beside him. Judge Holden read slowly. She turned each page carefully. She went back to the first page once and read something again. Then she looked up. "Counselor Graves," she said, "you may read the relevant sections." Leonard stood. He had his copy. He had prepared for this moment for weeks. He read Walter's observations of Carol's contributions to the household and the marriage. He read the sections documenting Walter's concerns about the family trust transactions. He read the part about the long afternoons in treatment, about the birthday in the kitchen, about 28 years of watching. And then he read the final paragraph. He read it slowly, the way a man reads something he knows matters. "I am a simple man. I ran a hardware store for 40 years. I measured things and I kept records and I tried to be honest. I am ending my silence now because at the end of a life, the only thing that matters is the truth." Carol Ann Whitfield was the foundation of my son's household. She raised his children. She managed his life so he could manage his business. She was present for everything that mattered, and she received credit for none of it. If this letter is being read in a courtroom, it means my son has done what I feared he would do. I want it on the record. I did not agree. I never agreed. She was worth everything he called nothing. And I have arranged for her to have something that belongs to her alone, so that when he is finished taking, she will have somewhere to stand. Leonard folded the letter. The courtroom was very quiet. Carol was looking at her hands in her lap. She was thinking about Walter's handwriting, careful and angular, the handwriting of a man who measured things. Douglas spoke. He had said nothing through the entire proceeding. He had let Barrett Coyne conduct everything with the detachment of a man who had paid someone to handle the unpleasant work. But in the silence after Walter's letter, in the quiet that hung over the courtroom like something held in suspension, Douglas said it. Not loudly, not in explosion. In the tight, contemptuous tone of a man who has just had something taken from him and cannot quite contain his reaction. "That letter is inadmissible. He cannot be cross-examined. She has nothing without that letter." A pause. Then clearly, carrying across the quiet room, "She brought nothing. She is nothing." The words landed. She brought nothing. She is nothing. Carol felt her hands tighten in her lap. She did not move. She did not look up. Judge Holden looked at Douglas over her reading glasses. It was a long look, the kind of look that has already reached a conclusion. Then she looked at Barrett Coyne. "Counselor," she said, in a voice like water over stone, "please advise your client that further statements of that nature will be significantly detrimental to his position in this proceeding." Barrett Coyne's jaw was tight. He put one hand on Douglas's arm. Douglas sat back. But the words were out. "She is nothing. 30 years. All of it, finally, given a sound. Leonard leaned close to Carol and said, very quietly, "Let him keep talking." She looked at Leonard. "Every word helps us," he said quietly. The proceeding continued for 2 more hours. Barrett Coyne worked to contain the damage. He was skilled and he was fast. He reframed Douglas's outburst as the understandable frustration of a man surprised by a will he had not known was changed. He argued that Walter's letter was personal sentiment, not legal evidence. Leonard argued otherwise. Judge Holden listened to both with equal attention. At the close of the session, she said she would take the matter under advisement and issue a written ruling within 30 days. She paused before she stood, tasked. "This court notes," she said without inflection, "the documented pattern of financial management and the specific nature of the assets bequeathed by Walter Whitfield. The respondent's contributions to the marital estate appear considerably more substantial than opposing counsel has characterized. A full accounting will be required." She stood. The room stood. The session ended. Carol sat for a moment while the room moved around her. Papers gathered, voices in the low register of legal proceedings, Leonard already in conversation with someone. Barrett coin on his phone. Douglas being guided toward the exit by a young associate. He passed near her table on the way out. He did not look at her. She brought nothing, he had said. She was worth everything he called nothing, Walter had written. She stood. She put on her coat. She wrapped the silk scarf around her neck, the deep rose of it warm against her throat. She walked out into the cold January air. She breathed it, clear and sharp and completely real. She drove directly to Patrice's after the courthouse. She did not call ahead. She drove and knocked on the door, and Patrice opened it, looked at Carol's face for 1 second, and said, "Come in and sit down, I'll make tea." Carol sat at Patrice's kitchen table and told her everything. The letter. Leonard's voice reading it in the quiet room, Douglas's face, the words. She is nothing. Patrice sat with both hands around her mug and said nothing until Carol finished. Nust. A long silence. Then she said, "He called you nothing." In front of a judge, out loud. Yes. Patrice was quiet for another moment. "What an extraordinary gift he gave you," she said. Carol looked at her. "He showed the judge exactly who he is," Patrice said. "He showed the room. He showed you in the clearest possible terms what all of those years looked like from where he was standing." She shook her head slowly. "He has been saying that to you privately for 28 years. And he finally said it in the one place he cannot take it back." Carol looked down at her tea. "It hurts," she said, "even knowing what I know, even knowing what is coming." Hearing someone say, "It's 28 years finally having a sound," Patrice said gently. They sat with that. The kitchen was warm. A candle burned on the counter. Something good was on the stove Patrice had been cooking when Carol knocked. The smell of it was warm and ordinary and good. "Stay for dinner," Patrice said. "I don't want to, Carol Ann Whitfield." Patrice looked at her directly. "You have been treating yourself as an interruption for 28 years. You are not an interruption. You are never an interruption. Stay for dinner." Carol stayed for dinner. Meredith called on the drive home. Carol put her on the car speaker. The city lights moved past the windows. The night was cold and still. "Dad called me," Meredith said. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone managing a great deal of feeling by being very precise about each word. "He's upset about the letter. I imagine he is. He said Grandpa was manipulated, that someone must have influenced him to make changes." Carol kept her eyes on the road. "Walter Whitfield was one of the sharpest, most clear-eyed people I have ever known. He changed that will because he chose to, because he knew what he knew and he made his decision." "I know that," Meredith said. "I know." A pause. "He said things today, in court. I heard about it." "Yes." Mom, her voice shifted, younger. The voice of a 12-year-old who has had a terrible day and is trying very hard not to cry. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry," I said that. "Meredith, I need to say it. I know I said I wouldn't take sides. But there's a difference between taking sides and knowing when your father was wrong." Another pause. "He was wrong. What he said was wrong. And it was not true." Carol drove without speaking for a moment. "No," she said softly. "It was not true. You are not nothing. You are." Meredith's voice broke slightly and then steadied. "You are the reason Garrett and I are okay. You know that, right? Whatever happens in that courtroom, whatever happens with any of this, you are the reason we turned out okay. That was you." Carol pulled to the side of the road. She pressed her hand over her mouth. She sat at the curb with the hazard lights blinking, and she breathed. In and out. In and out. "They see me," she thought. "They have always seen me. I was the one who stopped believing it." She took one more breath. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said. "I love you. I love you too, Mom." She sat at the curb until she could drive again. The judge's ruling came 26 days later. Leonard called at 9 in the morning. "Come in," he said. "This morning if you can." She was in his office by 10. He handed the ruling across the desk without preamble. 15 pages. She read the summary paragraph twice. Equitable distribution of marital assets. Weighted toward the respondent. Carol's share of the marital estate, 62%. The business holdings, the relevant portion allocated to Carol. As compensation for non-monetary contributions, the ruling specifically used the phrase substantial non-monetary contribution to the marital estate that directly enabled the growth of the primary business asset. The 18 months of account transfers, disallowed, ordered returned to the marital estate. Walter's bequest to Carol, confirmed as individual property, not subject to marital distribution. Total value coming to Carol, approximately $1.4 million. She set the pages on Leonard's desk. He called me worthless, she said. In open court, Leonard confirmed. Yes, and the judge read a dead man's letter and called my contributions substantial. 6 times, Leonard said. The word appears 6 times in the ruling. She sat with that for a moment. Substantial. Walter had written, she was worth everything he called nothing. What happens now? She asked. Barrett Coyne has 30 days to file an appeal on the business valuation. The core ruling is solid. The financial irregularity documentation makes an appeal strategically risky for Douglas. He paused. He may not appeal at all. And if he doesn't, then it stands. And you move forward. She looked at the January window. The oak tree, bare and budding. Leonard, she said, thank you. He looked slightly uncomfortable, the way he always did with direct gratitude. Your father-in-law built a strong case, he said. You knew how to use it. Yes, he said simply. That is my job. She sat in the parking garage for a long time afterward, the concrete walls, the weathered initials in a heart. The particular smell of a parking garage in January, cold and exhaust and concrete. She thought about the last 4 months. The September morning with the coffee still hot. The floor of the hallway in December. The closet reorganized at midnight. The silk scarf she had kept in the back of a shelf for 10 years. The solo dinner. The window rolled down in December just to feel the cold air. She thought about Walter taking her hand. I hope you know you're a good person, Carol. She had not known. Not with the solid, unquestioned certainty he seemed to have. She had hoped it. She had suspected it. But knowing the kind of knowing that does not need to be confirmed by someone else that had been eroded by 28 years of small, consistent erasures. She was beginning to get it back. Not through the ruling, not through the money, though that was real and she was grateful for it. Through something else. Through Wednesday nights on the hallway floor and Tuesday afternoons with Wendy Callahan and dinners at Patrice's kitchen table and Meredith's voice breaking on the phone. Through Walter, who had paid attention. Through herself, who was learning to pay attention again. She started the car, she went home. 3 months after the ruling, the appeal deadline passed. Douglas did not appeal. Barrett Coyne called Leonard 2 days after the deadline with the news. Leonard called Carol. She was in the garden, wearing rubber boots that had been sitting unused in the back of the garage for 2 years. She had gone out that morning with the intention of simply assessing what needed doing, and had ended up working for 3 hours. She took the call with her gardening gloves still on. No appeal, she said. No appeal, Leonard said. She looked at the Japanese maple. It was April, and the new growth was coming in small red leaves pushing out along the branches. Insistent and certain. Okay, she said. A pause on the line. That's all? I expected to feel more, she said honestly. I think I feel relieved. And a little like when you have been bracing for a long time and the thing doesn't come, and your body doesn't know what to do without the bracing. That sounds about right, Leonard said. What happens with Walter's financial documentation, the trust records? That has been referred to the appropriate regulatory bodies. It is, at this point, a matter between Douglas and them. He paused. It is not your problem, Carol. She let that phrase sit for a moment. Not your problem. She had carried his problems for so long that the absence of weight felt strange, like walking without a coat you have been wearing through a long winter. No, she said, it really isn't. She and Meredith had lunch in April at a restaurant neither of them had been to before. Big windows, good food. The particular energy of a lunch crowd that is happy to be exactly where it is. They split sparkling water and ate well and talked for nearly 3 hours. About Meredith's work, which was going well. About her relationship, which was going carefully. And from everything Carol could hear in her daughter's voice, in the right direction. About her apartment and her plans. Toward the end of lunch, Meredith asked, "Are you going to sell the house?" Carol looked out the window at the April street. People in various states of coat and no coat, that transitional spring look of a city negotiating with its own weather. I thought about it, Carol said. For months I thought the house was part of the old life, something that belonged to who we were and would have to go. And now I think the house is mine. She paused. I chose the paint colors. I planted that maple. I spent 19 years making that house into a home. She looked at her daughter. Douglas is the one who left it. I don't see why I should be the one to go. Meredith smiled slowly, a real smile. Not cautious or managed, just genuine. Good, she said. I always thought of it as your house anyway. Even when we were growing up, it always felt like yours. In May, Carol registered for a professional development program through the university extension. Marketing communications, updated for the current landscape. 6 months. 2 evenings per week. She had made no firm decisions about returning to the workforce. The course was the experiment. She would discover how it felt and proceed from there. She sat in the first session of the first class 18 students, ranging from Meredith's age to Carol's age and beyond, and the instructor asked each person to introduce themselves and explain why they were there. Carol said, I was a marketing professional 28 years ago. I left to raise a family. I'm here to find out how much of that woman is still present. The instructor, a woman in her 40s with quick energy and excellent earrings, smiled at her. That, she said, is one of the best reasons for being here that I have heard. After class in the parking lot, a woman named Donna fell into step beside her, 50 years old, recently divorced, back in the workforce after 15 years away. She had the specific look of someone who has been through the specific thing, the carefully neutral expression that is working very hard. I heard what you said in there, Donna said. I've been trying for weeks to figure out how to say why I'm here. You said it better than I could. Carol looked at her. I keep thinking of myself as someone who used to be something, Donna said. Maybe I should be thinking of myself as someone who has something left to build. That, Carol said, is exactly the difference. They walked to their cars. They exchanged numbers. Over the months that followed, they would become genuinely good friends, the kind you make in your 50s, when there is no longer any time for anything less than real. She had dinner with Evelyn Whitfield in June, Douglas's mother. This surprised everyone, including Carol herself. Evelyn had called on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice was old and careful, the voice of a woman who has thought for a long time about what she wants to say and has finally decided to say it. I'd like to see you, Evelyn said. If you're willing. Carol sat with that for a moment. Evelyn was 78. She had been for most of Carol's marriage. A presence of complicated warmth, not unkind but not warm, not hostile but not easy. The particular dynamic of women who raise sons to be the center of their world and are then quietly surprised when those sons become difficult husbands. She had loved Walter, and Walter had loved Carol. I'll come to you, Carol said. She drove to Evelyn's house on a Thursday evening. Evelyn made dinner pasta and bread and a salad from her garden, which was better than Carol had expected. They ate at a kitchen table very like Carol's own, in the warm light of a June evening, and they talked, mostly about Walter, who he was, the things he saw, the things he kept to himself for a long time and then finally did not. He changed the will, Evelyn said. He did not tell me all the reasons, but I understood. Carol waited. He loved you like a daughter, Evelyn said. Not the polite kind. The real kind where you actually see the person. She looked at her plate. I was not always easy on you when you were younger, when Douglas brought you home. Evelyn, I am not asking forgiveness. I am just acknowledging what I did. I thought Douglas could do no wrong for a very long time. He has good qualities, Carol said. He does. He is a difficult man in specific ways that mattered. But there were good years. And he is the father of my children. Evelyn looked at her steadily. You do not have to do that for me. I am not doing it for you, Carol said. I mean it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside, the June evening was going gold. He was taught to see women that way, Evelyn said finally, very quietly. His father, my first husband. Not Walter, he taught Douglas that women were peripheral. That is not an excuse. It is just I have been thinking about where things begin. She withdrew her hand. Walter tried to unteach it, she said. For years. Carol thought about that, the length of threads. How far back the damage went. How long the repair work took. Walter did unteach it, Carol said. In the end, in the way that mattered most. Evelyn looked at her. He saw me, Carol said simply, and he wrote it down. She completed the marketing program in September. At the small reception, the department held good coffee, a comfortable room. the low-key warmth of an accomplishment that does not require a stage. The instructor pulled Carol aside. "I have been talking to some colleagues about you," she said. "There is a small nonprofit looking for a communications director. Part-time, flexible hours. Women re-entering the workforce after caregiving years is their specific focus." A pause. "I thought of you immediately." Carol looked at her. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." 2 weeks later, she sat across a lunch table from the organization's executive director and talked for 3 hours. By the end of it, Carol had described without quite planting to exactly why she was right for the position. Not in spite of the 28 years away from professional work, because of them. She started in October. Her own desk, her own hours, largely. A project and a purpose and a door. She walked through every morning that had her name in a small way on it. On the first day, she sat in her chair in the small, bright office, and she thought, "I was exceptional at 24. And then, I am something different at 53. Something that 24-year-old Carol could not have been. Not despite the years. Because of them. She knew things now that could not be learned in a classroom. She knew what it meant to hold competing needs simultaneously. To budget without enough. To keep people functioning when they did not feel like functioning. To notice what was wrong before anyone said it out loud. To show up when showing up was inconvenient and do it without being thanked. She had done all of that. For 28 years. For no salary and no title and no line on a resume. Fine, let it go uncredited somewhere. Pond. She knew what it had built. She called it expertise. The women who came through the organization's programs, women in their 40s and 50s and 60s, women with gaps on their resumes like canyons, women who had been told in various ways, and by various people, that the years they had given were worth nothing. These women looked at Carol and saw something specific. They saw someone who had been where they were. Someone who had come out the other side with her dignity and her sense of humor and her rose silk scarf intact. The divorce was finalized in October. On the day it became final, Carol drove to the town where she had grown up, 40 minutes outside the city. She had not been back in years. She drove through the old neighborhood, past the elementary school with the same oak tree by the entrance, taller now, but recognizably itself. Past the house she had grown up in, smaller than memory, repainted a different color, a bicycle on the front porch that had not been there in her childhood. She sat in her car and looked at it. She thought about Carol Ann Brennan, 8 years old, running in the yard of that house, 12 years old, already with opinions about everything. 17, talking too fast and laughing too loud, and absolutely certain she was going somewhere. She was always here, Carol thought. She never actually left. I just stopped listening. She drove back through the October afternoon. The maples were at their peak, that extravagant, brief, completely committed red. She drove with the windows down because she liked the cold air on her face. She had lost a marriage. She was sorry about that. The sadness was real, not simple. Nothing about 28 years was simple but real. She was sorry for the good years, which had been genuinely good. She was sorry for what had not been repaired when it could have been. She was sorry for the particular grief of realizing that something you built with great care and effort has a foundational crack that was there all along. But she was not sorry for who she was today. That woman, the one driving with her windows down in October, who wore a silk scarf because she wanted to, who reorganized her closet at midnight and sat on kitchen floors and got back up and went to therapy on Tuesdays and made solo dinners and planted maples and wrote things down. That woman was not someone to be sorry for. That woman had been assembled from the hardest year of her life. She was a better construction than anything Douglas Whitfield had ever called her. She called Patrice when she got home. "It's final," she said. "How do you feel?" Carol stood at her kitchen window. The Japanese maple was blazing in the late afternoon light, October red, the color Walter had loved best. "Like a door opening," she said. "Not like an ending. It's been ending for a year." "I've had time for the ending," she paused. "Today feels like the first morning of something." "Good," Patrice said. "That's the right feeling. That is exactly the right feeling." "Patrice." "Yeah, thank you." Carol pressed her hand flat on the kitchen counter. The same counter she had gripped in September. That first morning when the coffee was still hot. For all of it. For coming over with muffins without being asked. For the dinners and the honesty, and she stopped. You know. I know, Patrice said. I have been biting my tongue for years. And then I didn't have to anymore. Carol laughed, real laughter. The kind that comes from somewhere deep and warm and does not need a reason. Come over Saturday, she said. I want to cook a real dinner. For people I love. I have not done that in a long time for the right reasons. I'll be there at 6, Patrice said. Meredith and Garrett both came. Carol cooked the way she liked, slowly, with good ingredients, just, with music in the kitchen, and the back door cracked open for the October air. Her mother's pasta, a roasted chicken she was happy with. A salad from things she had found at the farmer's market that morning. She set the table with the good plates. The good plates she never used because they were for company. Her children were company. Her best friend was company. The people she loved were worthy of the good plates. I deserve the good plates every single day, she thought, setting them out. What exactly have I been saving them for? They ate for 2 hours. Meredith and Garrett argued cheerfully about something inconsequential and laughed at each other. Patrice told stories from school, the particular kind of middle school stories that are simultaneously terrible and hilarious and require a specific kind of audience to appreciate. Carol ate and drank and watched the people at her table. This is mine, she thought. All of this, mine. After dinner, while Garrett and Meredith did the dishes, they insisted, and this time Carol let them. Patrice and Carol sat across from each other with the last of the wine. You look different, Patrice said. I feel different. Good different, yes. Carol turned her glass slowly. Wendy said something a few weeks ago. She said I came into this thinking of myself as a person who had lost something. And somewhere along the way, I started thinking of myself as a person who had found something. Patrice looked at her. I lost a marriage, Carol said. That is true, and I carry it. But I found out what I am actually made of, which turns out to be considerably more than I had been led to believe. She paused. I found out that my father-in-law saw me clearly for 28 years and loved what he saw and trusted that truth enough to have it read out loud in a courtroom. He was right to trust it, Patrice said. I found out my children see me. I found out I have a friend who comes over without being asked with a blueberry muffin and doesn't leave until I've eaten it. She looked at Patrice. I found out the woman I was at 24 is still in here. She is just 53 now. She has learned some things. She has stopped apologizing for taking up space. Patrice raised her glass. Carol raised hers. The crystal clinked a clean, bright sound in the warm kitchen. From the kitchen, the sound of Meredith and Garrett debating the correct way to stack pots. The warm, familiar sound of two people who have known each other their whole lives and still disagree about the pots. Outside the window, the Japanese maple stood in the October dark. She could not see it from where she sat, but she knew it was there, 12 years old. Finally, the size she had always imagined when she planted it, stubborn and beautiful, and taking up exactly the space it was supposed to. She went to see Walter's grave on a Sunday in November. The chrysanthemums she brought were yellow and white, the kind Walter had always grown along the south side of the Millhaven house, the ones he had called reliable. She cleared the fallen leaves from the stone and put the flowers in the holder and sat for a while in the November quiet. She did not talk out loud. She thought at him, the way you think toward people you have loved and lost. The way the conversation keeps going even after one side of it is gone. You saw me, she thought, when I had stopped seeing myself. You kept your own accounting when I wasn't keeping mine. And you arranged with that careful, meticulous hardware store precision for the truth to be told, in the one place it could not be dismissed. She looked at the stone. Walter James Whitfield, his dates, beloved husband and father. She thought with some warmth and some humor that he would have added meticulous record keeper if the stone had allowed for it. He would have found that entirely appropriate. I want you to know it isn't about the money, she thought. The money is real and I am grateful, and I will use it well and carefully. But that is not why I am here today. She looked at the stone. You believed I was worth writing down. After years of being told I wasn't worth very much at all. An old man with a careful hand and a drawer full of records said, "She was worth everything." And he made certain the right people heard it. She stood. She put her hand briefly on the cold stone. "Thank you," she thought. "Thank you for paying attention. Thank you for writing it down." In December, almost exactly 1 year after the worst Wednesday, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad and began to write. Not a memoir, not anything formal or intended for an audience. Just notes to herself, honest notes about the year. She wrote about the September morning. The coffee still hot, Douglas's hands on the table. She wrote about the hotel receipt soft from being folded, the account transfers highlighted in yellow. She wrote about the hallway floor in December, and the December dark and the sleet against the window. She wrote about Walter's handwriting, careful and angular. The way he wrote Carol Ann Whitfield, her full name, her complete name. Not just Carol or my daughter-in-law, but both names, as though making clear that this was a specific person with a specific identity, and he intended to be precise about who he meant. She wrote about what it felt like to be called nothing. Not the acute pain that she already knew. The other part, the slow, cold recognition of hearing out loud the thing you have sensed for years, but not permitted yourself to name. Then she wrote about what it felt like to have that overturned, not by rage, not by retaliation, by truth, by the simple, patient truth of a man who had been paying attention. She wrote about the nonprofit, her desk, the women who came through the program, the ones who looked at her the way she had once, looked at nothing in particular, that particular look of someone who has been told so many times that what they gave was worth nothing, that they have begun to believe it. She wrote what she wanted to say to them. She wrote, "The work you did has value, whether it was ever paid or acknowledged. Care is a skill. Household management is expertise. Raising children is a professional achievement that happens to come without a title. The world runs on what you did. Do not let anyone put a value of 0 on it." She wrote, "It is possible to be 53 and at the beginning of something. Starting over is not a failure. It is a door. You are not walking through something that happened to you. You are walking through something you chose. That distinction matters." She wrote, "Someone is paying attention. Someone is keeping records. Someone knows what you gave and understands what it was worth. And if right now the only person keeping those records is you, then start there. That is enough. It has to be enough. Begin with your own accounting. Tell the truth about what you gave. Tell the truth about what it cost. Tell the truth about what it was worth, and then write it down." She set down the pen. Outside the kitchen window, the first snow of the season had fallen in the night. Just a little. A thin, patient covering over the lawn and the garden beds and the Japanese maple. The branches were white-edged. The maple stood in the early December light, bare and outlined in snow, the structure of it completely visible now that the leaves were gone. It was beautiful, she thought. The kind of beautiful that has nothing to hide. She poured more coffee. She picked up the pen. She kept writing.
Carol Ann Whitfield did not start this story as someone who knew her own worth. She started it the way many of us start, standing at a kitchen counter, holding something warm, watching the world look exactly the same, even though everything has just broken. And what this story teaches us, quietly, without preaching through every chapter, is something that is both simple and very hard to hold on to. The invisible work was never actually invisible. When we give our years to a family, to a household, to the daily and exhausting labor of keeping people fed and healthy and loved and functioning, when we give all of that without a salary, or a title, or a line on a resume, the world has a way of making us feel that it did not count, that it was just what was expected, that it was, in the cold language of legal filings, negligible. But Carol's story tells us something different. It tells us that someone is always watching, not to judge, not to record grievances, but to bear witness. Walter Whitfield was not a dramatic man. He was a hardware store man. He measured things and kept records and said less than he knew. And in the final year of his life, He took everything he had witnessed, every birthday Carol hosted without acknowledgement, every appointment she drove to, every year she showed up while someone else took the credit. And he wrote it down. He made it matter in the only room where it could not be dismissed. The first lesson this story offers is this: your contribution has always had value. The fact that it was not named does not mean it was not known. The second lesson lives in Carol's darkest chapter. The Wednesday in December. The hallway floor. The sleet on the window. She did not call that moment a breakdown. She called it an inventory. She sat with the full weight of what she had given and what it had cost. She did not perform strength. She did not rush past the grief. She sat in the hallway, and she let herself know the truth. And then she got up. Not dramatically, not with a declaration. She simply got up and made tea and kept going. There is something profound in that, because the world tells women, and especially women of a certain age, in a certain kind of crisis, that the appropriate response is either collapse or immediate resilience. That you should either fall apart visibly or pull yourself together immediately. Carol does neither. She feels what is real. She names it. Honestly. She gets help. She calls her doctor. She begins therapy. She lets Patrice come over with muffins without pretending she is fine. And then she takes one step, and then another. The second lesson this story offers is this: you do not have to perform strength. Real strength is just the willingness to get up one more time than you fall. The third lesson is perhaps the most important. Carol does not win through revenge. She does not destroy Douglas. She does not set out to humiliate him. She does not spend her energy making sure he suffers exactly as much as she suffered. She spends her energy rebuilding herself. She takes a class. She reorganizes her closet. She eats alone at a restaurant she always wanted to try. She rolls the window down in December just to feel the cold air. She wears a silk scarf in a color she loves, because she loves it, not because anyone approved it. Small things, ordinary things, things that sound, described plainly, like nothing. But what they represent is enormous. They represent a woman returning to herself. Not the version of herself that was shaped by 28 years of negotiation and compromise and slow erasure. The original version. The exceptional 24-year-old who talked too fast and laughed too loud, and had 3 projects going, and a 4th forming. She was always in there, just compressed, just waiting for someone, including herself, to pay attention. The third lesson this story offers is this: starting over at 50 is not a tragedy. It is a door. And what comes through that door, when you walk through it honestly, with the full weight of everything you have learned, is not a lesser version of who you were. It is something more. So if you are carrying something like what Carol carried, if you have spent years giving more than you received, and being thanked less than you deserved, if someone has ever made you feel that the work you did, the work no one sees, the work no one pays for, the work the world quietly depends on, was worth nothing, then let this story be the thing Walter's letter was for Carol. Let it be the voice that says, "I was paying attention. I saw what you gave, and it was worth everything. You are not nothing. You never were. This content was researched, built, and manually edited by our team to bring you stories with real meaning and real lessons, stories that see you and tell the truth."